June 22, 1941. Just after 3 a.m., along an 1,800-mile front stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, over 3 million German and Axis troops move forward into the darkness. Thousands of artillery pieces open fire at once. Overhead, waves of Luftwaffe bombers race toward Soviet airfields, still lined up wingtip to wingtip, caught completely unprepared. Relocated entire factories east of the Ural Mountains, sometimes rebuilding them from rail cars within weeks, and kept producing tanks, aircraft, and soldiers at a pace Germany could not match. Later disasters, the destruction of an entire German army at Stalingrad the following year. Within hours, hundreds of Soviet aircraft are destroyed on the ground before they ever leave the runway. This is Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion force ever assembled in human history, and Adolf Hitler believes it will be over in a matter of weeks. He has told his generals the Soviet Union is a rotten structure that will collapse the moment German boots cross the border, like, in his own words, kicking in a rotten door. What he is about to discover instead is that he has just opened a war on a scale no nation, not even his own, could sustain. This single decision would be studied by military historians and war planners for the rest of the century as one of the clearest examples of strategic overreach in modern warfare. So how did the most powerful military machine in Europe, fresh off a string of unbroken victories, walk directly into a mistake it would never recover from? By the summer of 1941, Germany appeared unstoppable. France had fallen in 6 weeks the year before. Poland, Norway, the Low Countries, and the Balkans had all been overrun in rapid, decisive campaigns. Hitler had every reason, on paper, to feel confident. But underneath that confidence sat a decision that had been forming since long before the war even began. Hitler had written openly, years earlier, about his belief that Germany's future depended on seizing vast territory to the east, land he called Lebensraum, living space, that he believed would provide resources, farmland, and room for German expansion for generations. The Soviet Union, in his mind, was not just a rival power sharing an uneasy pact with Germany. It was the intended target all along, and the pact the two countries had signed 2 years earlier was never meant to be permanent. It had simply bought Hitler time to deal with the West first, on his own terms, before turning east on his own schedule. His military planners, chief among them officers in the German High Command, warned that invading before Britain was fully dealt with risked exactly what German strategy had always tried to avoid, a war fought on 2 fronts at once. Some pointed to the Kaiser's own generals a generation earlier, who had made the same mistake and lost. Hitler dismissed the concern. He believed the campaign in the East could be won quickly, before winter, using the same fast-moving tank and air tactics, the blitzkrieg approach, that had shattered France in weeks rather than years. 3 massive army groups were assembled, North, Center, and South, each aimed at a different Soviet objective. Army Group North would drive toward Leningrad, Army Group Center toward Moscow, and Army Group South into the resource-rich farmland and industry of Ukraine. The plan assumed Soviet resistance would crumble within roughly 10 weeks.
And lost.
It assumed Stalin's government, still reeling from purges that had gutted much of its own officer corps only a few years earlier, could be broken quickly under pressure. And it assumed, critically, that Germany would not need to fight through a Russian winter, because by Hitler's own timeline, the war in the East would already be won well before the first snow fell. Quartermasters were told to plan supply lines accordingly. Winter coats, in large numbers, were never even ordered. That single assumption, that speed alone could substitute for preparation, would become the seed of everything that followed. At first, the invasion looked like exactly the crushing success Hitler had promised. German panzer divisions tore through Soviet defenses, encircling entire armies in the opening weeks in a series of massive pincer movements. By some historical estimates, over 1 million Soviet soldiers were killed, captured, or wounded within the first month alone. Kiev fell, with an encirclement so large it remains one of the biggest single captures of prisoners in military history, well over 600,000 men in that pocket alone. Smolensk fell. German forces pushed within sight of Moscow's outer defenses by early autumn, and Leningrad in the north was placed under a siege that would eventually last nearly 2.5 years and claim the lives of hundreds of thousands of civilians through starvation and cold. But what looked like total collapse was quietly becoming something else, a war of distance and time that Germany had never planned for. The deeper German forces advanced into Soviet territory, the longer and more exposed their supply lines became, stretched across terrain with few paved roads and a rail gauge that didn't even match German trains, forcing engineers to rebuild captured track as they advanced, mile after painstaking mile. Fuel, ammunition, and winter clothing struggled to keep pace with troops who were still wearing summer uniforms as autumn temperatures began to drop. Some units reported advancing barely a few miles a day, tanks and trucks sinking axle-deep. By early December, temperatures near the Soviet capital plunged well below freezing, in some places past -30 degrees. German soldiers, without proper winter gear, suffered frostbite in staggering numbers, with some units reporting more casualties from the cold than from combat. Weapons jammed. Engines refused to start. Meanwhile, fresh Soviet reserves, many transferred from Siberia and the Far East once Stalin was confident Japan would not attack from that direction, counterattacked under General Georgy Zhukov and pushed the German front back from the outskirts of Moscow entirely, in some places by over 60 miles. The comparison historians most often draw is to Napoleon's invasion of Russia over a century earlier, another army that marched deep into Russian territory, confident of a quick victory, only to be broken by distance, resistance, and a winter it never planned to fight through. German commanders on the ground had actually studied that earlier campaign, and some had quietly raised the comparison themselves in the months before the invasion, only to be waved off by a leadership convinced that modern tanks and modern logistics had made the old lessons of 1812 irrelevant. Hitler had built an entire campaign on the assumption that the war would end before winter arrived. When it didn't, Germany was now fighting a grinding, resource-draining war on the Eastern Front that would never fully release its grip on the German military for the rest of the war. Hitler responded to the failure not by rethinking the campaign, but by removing the general leading the drive on Moscow and taking direct personal command of the army himself, a decision that placed the responsibility for every future setback squarely on his own shoulders. Germany would fight on the Eastern Front for nearly 4 more years, but historians widely agree that the war was never quite winnable for Germany after the failure to take Moscow in the winter of 1941. The campaign consumed a staggering share of German manpower, fuel, and equipment that could never be replaced quickly enough, while the Soviet Union, despite catastrophic early losses, relocated entire factories east of the Ural Mountains, sometimes rebuilding them from railcars within weeks, and kept producing tanks, aircraft, and soldiers at a pace Germany could not match. Later disasters, the destruction of an entire German army at Stalingrad the following year, where roughly 250,000 men were eventually killed or captured, the massive tank battles at Kursk in 1943 that broke the last major German offensive in the east, and the long grinding retreat that followed all the way back to Berlin, trace their roots back to this single decision made in the summer of 1941. Germany had entered the campaign with roughly 3,500 tanks. Within the war's first year in the East alone, losses in men, machines, and irreplaceable equipment had already outpaced anything German industry could realistically rebuild, even as factories ran around the clock, and even as the war in the West still waited, unfinished, for a resolution that would now never come on Germany's terms. If this kind of turning point breakdown is what keeps bringing you back, that's exactly why this channel exists. What makes Barbarossa remarkable isn't just its scale, it's how avoidable the core mistake actually was, opening a second front against the largest country on earth before finishing the fight already in front of him in the West. Today, the fields and forests where those opening battles took place have long since returned to farmland and quiet countryside across Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine. The roads German tanks once raced along are ordinary roads now, carrying ordinary traffic, with little to mark that this ground once decided the fate of the war. We cover a new turning point of the Second World War every week, so make sure you're subscribed for what's next.